Okay, hello again. Here we are again, ready for a bit more House of 60 Fathers. Of course, we left TM Power and Glory of the Republic in the dark. And what's been happening? Well, of course, he had run into a lot of trouble with his mum and dad for taking the American airmen across the river and back in the sampan, but he did earn 200 yen, which helped them buy some rice and other things, and he had to promise his mother and father that he would never take the sampan away from the bank again. And he didn't take it away from the bank when they went off again the next day to try and work at the American airfield. So he didn't take it away from the bank, but the water buffalo was crashing about in the dark and dislodged the sampan from the bank, and it floated off down the river with TM Pow inside, along with Glory of the Republic and the ducklings. Luckily, Beauty of the Republic, the little sister, was strapped to Mother's back going to the American airfield. And then the storm came and blew off the whole of the roof of the sampan, and TM Pow was wrecked on the shore, and he had to let the ducklings float away in their dishpan, and he climbed up the cliff and started a long journey to try and make his way through the hills and mountains back to where he could hopefully find his mother and father again. And so we'll move on. We've left him. He's in a dark cave. With Glory of the Republic. He's wet and cold, very hungry. TM Pow had difficulty holding his shivering body still while he looked about him to size up the situation. The little cave into which he had blundered last night was in the side of a towering cliff that rose like a poking finger, tall and solitary, into the sky. A narrow path corkscrewed past the cave and up the steep back of the cliff. The path must lead on through the mountains, and somewhere along it must certainly be some little cave for hiding. He shivered and flexed his stiff aching body. The rumble down below became stronger to his ears. It worried him. He hastily undid the rope to give the little pig full freedom to find a cave, and then they hurried up the cliff. Day was dawning. They climbed higher and higher up the tall cliff, and as they climbed, they searched. Glory of the Republic dug and snuffled. TM Pow poked into every likely-looking crevice, crack. There seemed to be no other cave in this sharp, solitary cliff. They hurried on up. They rounded a turn in the twisting path. It proved to be the last turn. TM Pow and Glory of the Republic were on top of the peak. The domed top was smooth and bald like the old head of an old man. There was nothing on the rounded dome but a lone thorn bush and a huge boulder, worn smooth and polished. TM Pow looked at it in dismay. The high peak was nothing but a lookout point. The path had led to nothing but the big boulder, polished and worn by generations that had come here to sit and look down at the valley and the river. The rumble in the valley beat up against the lone cliff. Morning sunlight reflected off the polished boulder. Full daylight, there was no time to lose. In full sunshine, they'd have to rush all the way down the cliff, climb up a farther mountain, and then still find a cave to hide in. Unless there might be a cave somewhere on the riverside of this peak. Tien Pao hurried over the dome to the thorn bush for a quick look. What he saw below made him gasp. The high cliff jutted out over the river. Straight underneath him glistened the water, but across the river in the deep river valley was a road, and from that road came the endless rumble. Huge trucks were grinding down that road, bumper to bumper. Dust clouds rolled up behind the trucks. Now into the dust of the trucks came a troop of galloping horses. Soldiers with rifles sat straight and proud on the backs of the horses. Behind these mounted troops came horses pulling cannon, 6 horses to a cannon. The Japanese were on the move. They were going the same way he was going, towards Hengyang. As the stunned Tien Pao stood looking down on this scene from behind the thorn bush, the men on the cannon all of a sudden began whipping their horses. The troop of horsemen leaned over the necks of their horses and thundered on into the dust behind the trucks. The trucks rolled faster. The grinding of the trucks whined up against the cliff. The Japanese soldiers were looking up. They twisted their necks and looked up into the sky, and the air over the river was clear and bright. It looked almost as if they were staring right at Tien Pao on the top of the cliff. Tien Pao too twisted his neck and looked up into the sky behind him. There in the morning sky a speck appeared. It was like the speck a hawk makes when he sails over the yard of a farmer where chickens are pecking the straw. But it wasn't a high speck anymore. It was a swift, high aeroplane, and now it fell screaming out of the sky towards the trucks and the horses. Down below, the trucks were not riding packed together anymore. They were strung out along the road. Horsemen had tumbled off their horses and lay along the road, their rifles pointing to the sky. But the men on the cannon still came on. They leaned far out. They lashed their horses on. All in one screaming moment, the aeroplane was above the road and along the road, low now, big and snarling. Then it happened as it had happened at Tien Pao's village. This aeroplane too came with a horrible stuttering screech of bullets. But this was not against a peaceful Chinese village and helpless sampans. This was against the Japanese. Are you wondering who's flying that aeroplane? Some of the trucks stopped. Some of the drivers threw themselves into the rice paddies along the road. Some of the trucks rolled on into the hail of bullets and explosions. A truck turned over, its wheels thrashing the air like the many feet of a great clumsy bug. A truck burst into flames and stopped. The truck behind crashed into it with a sound of thunder. The driver pitched through the glass into the flames of the truck ahead. In flashing swiftness, the aeroplane and its hail of bullets were beyond the trucks. The plane came back. It zigzagged from one side of the road to the other to catch the horses and men running into the fields. The awful, unearthly scream of horses rent the air and beat against the cliff. Tien Pao dug his fingers into his ears, but it was as if the screaming went on inside him. His skin went tight with horror, but he kept looking. He couldn't tear his eyes away. Men fell. Horses fell. Men tumbled off cannon, and the cannon went over them behind the madly plunging horses. Horses broke loose from their traces and reared and floundered in the deep muddy ooze of the rice paddies. One, wounded and maddened, thrashed over the bank into the river and sank from sight. But not all of the men who lay along the road lay still. Some raised rifles and fired at the low sweeping plain. Let's have a little look at the picture in the book, or from the book. There's a Japanese soldier with his rifle. They fired at the low sweeping plain. Bullets smacked into it, and once the plane jerked queerly as if it had stumbled in the air. But it rose, the way a great wounded bird swoops up, shaking itself. Higher it climbed, higher in a straight zooming upward line towards a peaceful cloud bank drifting over the river. But before the plane could quite reach the cloud bank, a black mass of smoke belched out of it. For a moment it was hidden from Tien Pao's sight in its own black smoke, but only for a moment. The next moment the plane came falling through the smoke down towards the road and the river. Tien Pao squeezed his eyes shut. He trembled. He could not bear to see the helpless plane spinning and whistling down to the earth. His fists clenched and unclenched. Then a new sound came to Tien Pao's ears, the sound of a motor coughing. When he opened his eyes, the aeroplane had somehow straightened out of its helpless dive. It was going down, but it spun no longer. Somehow it found the road. Somehow it leaped and bumped down onto the road and bounced along it. It stopped too soon. It stopped too short. Its tail flew up and flipped over. There lay the plane on its helpless back. A roaring mass of yellow flames gushed out of it. On top of the cliff, Tien Pao could not breathe. There lay the flaming plane. No one could be alive in that. But out of the flames a man came tumbling. His clothes were on fire. He tumbled and rolled away from the plane, and he beat at his clothes with his bare hands. He jumped up, ripped off the aviator's helmet that was smouldering at the back of his neck, and beat at the flames with that. But was that the airman? Was it the yellow-haired airman he had rowed across the river? His river god? Tien Pao could not believe it. With his eyes riveted on the man, he talked to Glory of the Republic about it. Short little unbelieving words. It couldn't be. Oh, it couldn't be. He had seen only one airman. Maybe all Americans had yellow hair. It must be that. In the valley, the Japanese had started running. They jumped up from everywhere. And ran towards the distant burning plane. The airman crouched in the bushes, still beating at his smouldering clothes. Run, run, Tien Pao wanted to shout. Run. He must not shout. He dared not shout. As if the yellow-haired airman had heard the shout, Tien Pao had not shouted. He suddenly backed away into the bushes. The first two Japanese came racing down the road towards him. They did not know anything alive had come out of those flames. In the bushes a pistol gleamed. It spat, and again. The two Japanese fell on the open road. But others were coming, and the white soldier knew it. For now he broke from the bushes and ran towards the river. But he was slow. He must run faster, faster. Then Tien Pao saw that he dragged his leg. Now he stopped. He clung to a bamboo clump for support. Now he limped off again in his crouching run. He did not run straight. He kept clumps of bushes and bamboo between him and the Japanese. Now he started on the last short sprint to the river bank. Two Japanese came around a bamboo clump. The white soldier threw himself flat. Then his pistol barked. One Japanese fell, but the other crawled on, hidden by the bamboo. And as he crawled, he held his pistol ready, but he did not shoot. By that, Tien Pao knew that the Japanese were trying to take the airman alive, and he remembered what his mother had told him. If they caught him, they would torture him. Bamboo splinters under the fingernails. The crawling torture pains stabbed up into Tien Pao's fingers again, the way they had done when he had sat before his mother on the bench in the sampan. And there was nothing he could do for the airman. Nothing. But the airman had known about the second Japanese. There was a shot. The Japanese let slip his hold on the bamboo clump and sagged. The airman turned to dive into the river. It was a trick. It was a trick. Didn't the airman know? Didn't he see? The Japanese was coming around the bamboo. In one bounding leap, clearing the space between him and the airman on the bank. Before he realised he was doing it, Tien Pao was screaming out, "Look out! Look out!" It was Chinese, but it was a warning scream, and that the airman had understood. He whirled, he shot. It was all one motion, but this time the Japanese crumpled, and this time it was no trick. And now the airman slid over the bank and into the river. From the high cliff, Tien Pao saw him swimming underwater. He angled off with the current towards a big branch floating down the middle of the river. But the current took him away, and then he was gone from sight. Just the branch floated downriver. The Japanese had heard Tien Pao's screams. From across the river, up-pointed rifles searched the cliff. A rifle spat, and the shot shattered a branch of the thorn bush above Tien Pao's head. Tien Pao shook in terror. Somehow he kept himself from running. One thing he had learned from the airman: he did not run in terror. Instead, he threw himself flat and lay, still as death, behind the bush. He pressed Glory of the Republic down beside him, but he couldn't keep himself from staring in fascinated horror through the branches of the bush at the up-pointed searching rifles. It couldn't be believed. He could clearly see the riflemen with their cheeks laid over the rifles, searching, aiming, searching for him, aiming for him, to kill him. It couldn't be believed. Tien Pao had to fight off panic, had to fight to keep from running headlong over the cliff and down the path. He must keep down. He mustn't move, and if he moved, he mustn't raise himself at all, but crawl. Slow, slow, slow. That was what the airman had done. Slow now, keep down. Crawl. Slowly Tien Pao twisted his face away from the river bank and the rifles. He studied the path up which he had come. Slow now, slow. Slide. Flat. Inch ahead. Holding Glory of the Republic down by his front legs so he couldn't possibly rear up, Tien Pao slithered. Where am I? Down the path up which he had come. He dragged the little pig inch by inch beside him. Glory of the Republic mustn't squirm. No, Glory, no. The little pig did not care to be dragged along on his side. He grunted, he struggled. Tien Pao forced him down again. Even that quick movement had been seen. A shot rang out. The bullet smashed against the polished boulder, bounced and cannoned off with an angry, stinging whine. Something smacked hard against Tien Pao's cheek. He clapped his hand to his stunned cheek. His hand came away bloody. Before him lay the flattened slug of the bullet that had bounded from the rock and hit his cheek. Tien Pao stared at it, stared at his bloody hand. He lay still. It was suddenly silent down below in the valley. Then there were shouts far down the river, and Tien Pao knew horror, for he realised what the Japanese were doing. They were going after the airman in force, but meanwhile 1 or 2 riflemen were keeping him on the high solitary hill. That was all that was needed, just a bullet now and then to keep him on the cliff, and when they had the airman, they'd come and get him. There were 2 shots far down river. Much later, out of the stillness in the valley, came a scream, a short scream cut off. Had they caught him? They must have caught the airman. They were torturing him. Now they would come across the river and mount the cliff to capture him and Glory of the Republic. Tien Pao's outstretched hand clenched and unclenched around the bullet slug on the ground before him. He had to know. He had to raise his head to see what was happening in the still valley. The sampan was leaving the opposite bank of the river. A sampan full of soldiers. It was heading straight for the cliff, coming for him. They were coming. They'd torture him too for what he had done. In his terror, Tien Pao forgot all caution. He flung himself up, fled headlong over the round top of the cliff. At his first lunge, the shots rang out. Tien Pao crazily threw himself ahead of the vicious whistling sound of bullets, threw himself over the round top of the cliff, as if he could outrace bullets. Then he was over the cliff. For the moment he was out of range of the riflemen, protected by the shoulder of the cliff. But he tore on at the blind mad pace down the steep cliff. He fell, picked himself up, raced on again. Glory of the Republic bowled on behind him. They raced on again. They left the lone cliff behind, ran back the way they had come the night before, ran down river, the way the airman had gone. Tien Pao did not know where he was going, but anywhere away from the cliff and the bullets. Any place was better. Then the thought struck him. If the Japanese had not yet caught the American airman, this whole country downriver would be full of searching parties. He forced himself to slow down. Be cautious, listen. He mustn't go crashing along paths to run full tilt into the Japanese. He had to hide at once. He left the path and edged up the first cliff that looked as if it might provide shelter and concealment. The squat cliff was strewn with huge rocks, and all the tight places between the rocks were jammed with brush and thorns. It was terrible, impossible climbing. Glory of the Republic lagged more and more behind. Tien Pao had to wait for him. At the spot where Tien Pao stood waiting, the leaves lay heaped high in the split of a rock. This wasn't a cave, just a narrow crevice open to the sky, but it might be possible to hide behind the piled up leaves. It would have to do. Glory of the Republic was grunting so painfully, Tien Pao knew he could hardly climb any more. He grabbed a handful of leaves, held them up, crunched and rattled them to coax the little pig on. Then he attacked the piled leaves, raking and pouring them away with both hands to get at the crevice. Tien Pao stopped for a moment, looked back to see if Glory of the Republic was coming. In the momentary quiet there was a rattling in the leaves, not of Tien Pao's making. Swift as a snake, a hand struck through the piled leaves. The hand grabbed Tien Pao's throat. Tien Pao's startled scream was cut off as the savage grip closed around his throat. He was jerked off his feet, head first into the pile of leaves. In his terror, Tien Pao thrashed so fiercely in the leaves, Glory of the Republic became frightened and bolted down the cliff. In the crevice of the rock, Tien Pao's terrified eyes stared at a white, blotched face and singed hair. It was the airman. His airman. His river god. The airman did not know him. His grip tightened around Tien Pao's throat, and his other hand clamped over Tien Pao's mouth so hard Tien Pao's lips crushed down on his teeth. He tasted blood. His eyes started out of their sockets. He felt himself going limp. Dimly he still heard a rustling among the leaves as if far away, but the airman whipped around to face whatever was coming. Then Glory of the Republic burst through the piled leaves. The startled airman looked from the pig to the boy he was choking. Immediately he released his hold on Tien Pao, and a great gush of air sobbed into Tien Pao's empty lungs. He hung his head to clear his eyes. He managed a sick little smile. The man grinned back, but he looked terribly puzzled. Then Tien Pao realised that, dirty as he was, thin and starved and caked with paddy mud, the airman had not recognised him. If it hadn't been for Glory of the Republic... Oh, Tien Pao rubbed his throat. He knew the airman could not imagine why he and the pig were here, but how could he tell him? Tien Pao pointed up to the sky. Then he made his hand go spiralling down the way the aeroplane had gone down. He cupped his hands to his mouth as if shouting a great shout, then pointed to himself. The airman grinned, nodded. He understood. They sat grinning at each other. They had no words. The airman began building up the disturbed leaf pile again. But Tien Pao leaned back against the rock pile with a great tired sigh. Now he was safe. He laughed a little. He felt so safe with the airman, even though the Japanese might be all around. The airman turned to look hard at him. Tien Pao looked back at the airman and laughed until tears filled his eyes. And then he wasn't laughing, he was crying. Now he was safe, but he was crying, and right before the airman. Tien Pao turned his shamed face away. He grabbed the little pig and pulled him to his chest. He tried to muffle the hard-wrenching sobs against the little pig's muddy hide. Tien Pao did not know that this was shock and the reaction from the terrible danger. now that he was suddenly safe, but the airman knew. He reached over, pushed the pig away, and took Tien Pao into his own lap. He sat and rocked the sobbing Tien Pao gently, slowly, like a mother. And the airman, in the soft, sweet relief of his own escape from death, crooned like a mother to a little baby. I know just how you feel, little fellow. Yes, you don't have to be ashamed. I know how it feels to be shot at. Tien Pao did not understand, but the words were soothing, and at last he managed to grin up at the man. At once the airman poked his finger into Tien Pao's hollow stomach. It must mean, "Have you eaten?" Tien Pao dashed his tears away and sat up eagerly. He shook his head. He grabbed a leaf and crunched it between his teeth to show what he had been eating. The airman made a face. He began digging in his pockets. He broke... Tien Pao could not keep his eyes away from the man's searching hand. At last the airman drew a bar of chocolate from one of his many pockets. He broke off a morsel and gave it to Tien Pao. He started to give Glory of the Republic a tiny piece, but with a wry grin he gave the little pig a handful of leaves instead and handed the second morsel also to Tien Pao. Tien Pao kept the second little piece of chocolate pinched between his fingers while he slowly chewed the first little piece. He slowly let it melt in his mouth. He let it flow sweetly and slowly down his throat. Never in his life had he tasted anything so heavenly. After it was gone, he licked around his lips for any left-over droplet of chocolate, and then there was still the other little piece. Now he could do it all over again. He closed his eyes. He rocked himself in the joy of it. When he opened his eyes, the chocolate was gone. He badly wanted to ask for more. His stomach all but screamed for more, but he did not ask, for he suspected that the one bar of chocolate was all the airman had. One piece to break a crumb from now and then in their days and nights ahead. Their days and nights ahead. Now, why? Now he wouldn't be alone any more. Tien Pao laughed softly up at the airman. The airman closed his arm around Tien Pao. He understood. He didn't need words. Together they suddenly tensed and sat up. Down below in the unseen valley the rumble had begun. The grinding sound of trucks came through the wall of leaves. It must mean that the Japanese had abandoned the search. The convoy was on its way again on the road in the valley. They looked at each other and Tien Pao opened his mouth to say something, but the airman laid a finger on his lips. He must mean that it might be a trick and that they must still be cautious. All the Japanese had not necessarily gone on with the convoy. All the same, Tien Pao and the airman both leaned against the rock wall of the crevice, and together they sighed their relief. The bubbling feeling of wonderful safety was so enormous in him, Tien Pao somehow had to indicate how he felt. Somehow he had to tell the airman that they would go on together. He closed his eyes as if in sleep and pointed to them. That had to indicate the night. He made his fingers walk along his legs, made them climb, made them go down. It had to mean that when night came they would set off through the dark river mountains together. But the airman looked anxious. First he pulled Tien Pao's face close to him and peered at the wounded cheek. He tossed his head to indicate it looked all right, but then he raised his own trouser leg and showed Tien Pao an ugly gaping wound, an awful, deep, huge burn. The burn already looked poisonous, tinged green-black around the edges. The airman made his fingers walk, pointed to his leg and shook his head. It meant he could not walk. He groaned and ran the tip of his tongue around his lips. That must mean the wound was making him sick and feverish after the struggle to get to this hideout. Tianpao nodded to show that he completely understood. To show it further, he hastily began making a bed of the leaves. He indicated that the airman should lie down and sleep. He opened his own eyes wide and held them open with his fingers to tell the man that he would keep watch. The man nodded eagerly, stretched out. Almost the next moment, he was asleep. Tianpao sat beside the airman, hovering over him, watching, ready to lay his hand over the man's mouth, for the airman tossed in an unhappy, feverish sleep, and often he talked out in his foreign tongue, and no one must hear. It was so unbelievably good not to be alone, so good to be with a human being. Nothing must separate them again until they got to Hengyang. And that is where we will leave Tianpao for now with his American airman friend. How's he going to get that American airman over the hills and mountains with his bad leg and no food? Well, we'll just have to wait and see what happens next. So, until next